Lake Michigan stretched before me like a gray mirror, accurately reflecting the grayness that enveloped my soul. The autumn wind howled through the maple trees that had turned yellow, rustling like mournful sighs. This small log cabin, where we had once built our nest, now also carried a smoldering sadness, as silent as I was. It had been over a year since that fateful day took him away, David, the man to whom I had given my whole heart. A long, drawn-out year, enough for the external wounds to heal, but not enough to fill the void he left in my heart. This log cabin, once a witness to so many of our happy moments, was now just an empty shell, reminding me of the irreparable loss. I tried to maintain my daily routine, but every action, every habit became heavier and more difficult than ever. I spent most of my time in the small garden, David's favorite place. The bright yellow chrysanthemums, the fruit trees laden with fruit, all were priceless keepsakes he left behind. Every time I touched them, I felt like he was still here, somewhere around me, watching over me. But it was just an illusion, a temporary comfort for my bleeding heart. One late autumn afternoon, while I was cleaning the storage room, a task I had always put off because it contained so many of David's belongings, the phone rang, interrupting my wandering thoughts. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, introducing himself as Chris, David's son from a previous relationship. I knew about Chris. David rarely mentioned his son. I guessed the relationship between the two had not been good. Perhaps it was one of his greatest regrets. Chris said that he had just lost his job and was experiencing financial difficulties. He had nowhere else to go and asked if he could stay temporarily at the log cabin. My heart suddenly tightened. I had never lived with anyone besides David. The thought of another man, and David's son at that, living under the same roof, made me feel confused and anxious. I hesitated slightly. A feeling of unease crept into my heart. Should I agree? Would this disrupt my already too quiet life? But then, I remembered the few words David had spoken about Chris. Though brief, his voice contained a deep affection. I couldn't refuse someone in need, especially David's son. "All right," I said, my voice as gentle as possible. "You can come." A few days later, Chris arrived. He was a tall young man, with dark brown hair and deeply sad eyes. He carried an old backpack and had a shy, reserved demeanor. Looking at him, I felt a pang of sympathy. I tried to be friendly and welcoming, but Chris seemed to keep a certain distance. The look in his eyes held something indescribable, both distant and probing. In the first few days, Chris lived quite reclusively. He spent most of his time in his room, only coming out for meals. I tried to talk to him, asking about his work, about his life, but Chris only gave brief answers and avoided eye contact. I felt like there was an invisible wall between us, separating two people living under the same roof. I began to feel worried. Had I made the right decision? Was letting Chris stay with me a mistake? Could we live together harmoniously under one roof, or would he just be a constant reminder of my loss? Outside the window, the wind still blew strongly, carrying the cold of the approaching winter. Lake Michigan remained silent, witnessing the changes in my life and the arrival of Chris, a prelude to unforeseen events. A premonition of something ominous arose in my heart. That night, after Chris quietly left my room, sleep completely eluded me. The image of him in the pale moonlight, along with the gentle touch of his lips on my forehead, kept repeating in my mind, like a haunting slow-motion film. It wasn't a romantic kiss, devoid of lust, but it stirred within me a sense of unease, an indescribable disturbance. It shattered the tranquility I had tried to build around myself since David's passing. I wondered if I was being too suspicious. Perhaps, as Chris said, he just wanted to check if I was okay. Perhaps I had exaggerated everything. But deep down, a small but persistent voice kept whispering that something was wrong. The way he looked at me then, the hesitation in his every word, all contained a secret, something he was trying to hide. The next morning, I tried to appear as normal as possible. I prepared breakfast as usual, a habit I had maintained since David was still here. The clatter of the knife and cutting board, the fragrant smell of coffee spreading through the space, all were familiar, but today, they carried a hint of awkwardness. Chris came downstairs looking tired, with dark circles under his eyes. He maintained his polite demeanor, but was more taciturn than usual. He avoided looking directly at me, and when I asked about last night, he only replied briefly that he hadn't slept well. That explanation only made me more suspicious. Throughout the day, an invisible tension enveloped the house. I tried to find something to do, from cleaning dusty corners to tending the garden, a place David had devoted much of his heart to. I wanted to fill the time, dispel the wandering thoughts that were occupying my mind. But no matter what I did, the image of Chris from last night still haunted me. That gentle lip touch, though fleeting, left a deep impression on me. In the following days, I began to notice small changes in Chris's behavior. He frequently appeared in the places I was, as if he was always watching me. He also often offered to help me with chores around the house, from bringing firewood to the fireplace to watering the yellow chrysanthemums that David had planted. At first, I felt grateful for his help. But gradually, that gratitude gave way to a feeling of discomfort, even unease. The way Chris looked at me was no longer simply the concern of a son for his stepmother. It contained something deeper, more intense, a feeling I couldn't name, but that made me feel uneasy and worried. It was unlike the affection David had for me, a gentle and trusting love. Chris's gaze, it was burning, it was probing, it made me feel exposed. One evening, I was trying to focus on a book by the fireplace, but my mind was completely distracted. Chris entered the living room. He sat down on the opposite chair, staring at me. His eyes didn't leave me, making me feel suffocated. "Eleanor," he said, his voice deep and warm, pulling me out of my wandering thoughts. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I replied, trying to keep my tone normal, but my heart started beating faster. "Is something wrong?" "I'm just worried about you," Chris said. "Since that night, I've noticed you haven't seemed happy." He hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. I was silent for a moment. I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to hurt him, or worse, acknowledge the strange feeling that was growing within me. "It's nothing," I finally said, a hollow and meaningless answer. "I'm just a little tired." Chris looked at me with a probing gaze, as if trying to read the thoughts hidden deep within me. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. I nodded, trying to avoid his eyes. I felt my heart pounding, as if it wanted to jump out of my chest. I knew that there was something unspoken between Chris and me, a secret that was slowly growing in the darkness, a dangerous feeling that was budding. Outside the window, the wind still blew strongly, carrying the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Night enveloped the house, hiding secrets and the emotions that were gradually rising. I felt trapped in a difficult situation, a spiral that I didn't know how to escape. The unease within me grew stronger, like a bad omen. Mark's presence always brought a warm, comfortable atmosphere to this log cabin. He was David's best friend from college, a middle-aged man with a kind heart and a gentle smile. After David passed away, Mark often visited me, helping me repair things around the house, tending the garden, where David had poured his heart, and sharing stories about him. I was always grateful for Mark's concern. He was like a solid emotional support for me during lonely days, a friend I could trust and rely on. But Chris didn't seem to feel much affection for Mark. Whenever Mark came, he always maintained a silent, somewhat cold and distant attitude. I noticed this, a subtle jealousy, but I told myself it was just a young person's shyness when interacting with an older person and awkwardness when an outsider appeared in our private space. I tried to convince myself of that. One Saturday afternoon, Mark visited me as usual. He brought a homemade apple pie, a dessert that David loved. The sweet aroma of apple pie spread throughout the house, evoking beautiful memories of David. I felt a warmth in my heart at Mark's thoughtfulness, a little warmth creeping into my cooling heart. "David would have loved this pie," I said, my voice slightly choked. Memories of him flooded back, making me emotional. He always loved my apple pies, Mark smiled kindly, a smile that made me feel reassured. I still remember the times we went apple picking together at my family's orchard, and then made pies together. Those memories are beautiful. Chris sat silently in a corner of the room, looking at Mark with an incomprehensible, even scrutinizing gaze. He didn't participate in our conversation, just quietly sipped his coffee, like an outsider. His silence made me feel a little awkward. While Mark and I were chatting happily about old memories, Chris suddenly spoke. "Eleanor, can I help you clean the storage room? I think it's a bit messy." I was a little surprised by Chris's offer. He rarely volunteered to do housework, especially a heavy task like cleaning the storage room. I was slightly suspicious, not understanding his true purpose. "All right," I said, trying to keep my tone natural. "But it's okay to do it after dinner." "It's all right," Chris said, his eyes looking at me resolutely. "I want to do it now." Chris stood up and walked towards the storage room. I watched him with a suspicious look. I felt a subtle competition between Chris and Mark, something I couldn't explain, but that made me feel uneasy. It wasn't just shyness or awkwardness, but a stronger, more complex emotion. After dinner, Mark helped me wash the dishes. Meanwhile, Chris was still in the storage room. I felt a little worried, a bad feeling creeping over me. I decided to go see how Chris was doing. When I entered the storage room, I saw Chris standing amidst the old belongings, holding a photograph. It was a photo of David and me on our wedding day. Chris looked at the photo with sad eyes, as if he was looking at something very distant and unreachable. "This photo is beautiful," Chris said, his voice slightly trembling. I walked closer to Chris. I looked at the photo, memories of that happy day flooding my mind, making my heart ache with a familiar pain. "It was a very happy day," I said, my voice choked. Chris was silent for a moment and then turned to look at me. "Do you miss Uncle David?" he asked, his eyes looking at me scrutinizingly. "Of course I do," I replied, my voice trembling. "I always miss him." Chris looked at me with deep eyes, as if wanting to read the thoughts hidden deep within me. "I miss him too," he said, his voice lowering. "But I wish I could have known him better." I felt a deep empathy with Chris. I understood his loss, the regret of not having more time with his father. "David loved you very much," I said, my voice gentle and sincere. "He was always proud of you." Chris looked at me with grateful eyes, a glimmer of warmth flashing in his sad eyes. He moved closer to me, the distance between us narrowing. I felt a little flustered, but also a strange feeling, a tremor that I had been trying to bury for so long. Just then, Mark entered the storage room. He saw the scene of Chris and me standing close together, our eyes meeting with hidden meaning. Mark's face flashed with surprise, then quickly changed to a serious, even cold expression. "I apologize if I'm interrupting," Mark said, his voice slightly cold and distant. "I just wanted to ask if anyone needed help." Chris and I turned around startled. The intimate moment between us was interrupted. I felt a little flustered and embarrassed, while Chris looked at Mark with an uncomfortable, even hostile look. The tension in the air became clearer than ever. I sensed that something unsettling was happening between Chris and Mark, something beyond my understanding, a silent war in which I had inadvertently become the center. The rain started in the late afternoon. Heavy raindrops pounded on the roof of the log cabin, creating a steady, mournful sound, like my own silent weeping. The wind blew strongly, shaking the maple trees by the lake, the rustling a chilling sound like drawn-out sighs. I sat alone in the living room, looking out the window. Darkness enveloped the landscape, swallowing everything into the murky night. Only the faint yellow light from inside the house remained, flickering and lonely, accurately reflecting my mood at that moment. Mark had left after the tense evening in the storage room. His disappointed gaze when he saw Chris and me standing close together still haunted me. I knew I had hurt Mark, a sincere friend, someone who had always been by my side since David's passing. But I also couldn't deny the tremor that Chris brought, a feeling I had tried to bury deep inside since David's death. A smoldering fire had been rekindled, burning my reason and the artificial peace I had tried to maintain. Chris had also been silent since that evening. He avoided me, no longer giving me lingering glances or offering help. He returned to his reclusive and distant demeanor from his first days here. His silence made me feel even more uneasy and guilty. I wondered if he was blaming me, or if he himself was struggling with tangled emotions. Late into the night, I still couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain and the howling wind made me feel even more anxious and worried. I tossed and turned in bed, wandering thoughts constantly invading my mind. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. A gentle knock, but enough to wake me from my hazy thoughts. My heart pounded. I went to open the door and saw Chris standing there. He was soaking wet, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale. The heavy rain seemed to have seeped into his soul, carrying a deep sadness, a despair that I could feel. "Eleanor," Chris said, his voice trembling, almost a whisper. I can't sleep." I looked at Chris with sympathetic eyes. I knew that he was also going through internal struggles and torments, just like me. I could also feel the loneliness and helplessness in his eyes. "Come in," I said, pulling Chris inside. I couldn't leave him standing out in the freezing rain like that. Chris entered the house, shivering from the cold. I got him a towel and a cup of hot tea. We both sat silently by the fireplace, only the crackling of the fire and the sound of the rain outside breaking the silence. The flickering flames cast light on Chris's face, highlighting the worried lines on his face. After a while, Chris spoke, breaking the heavy silence. I'm sorry about that night," he said, his voice choked with regret. "I shouldn't have." "It's okay," I interrupted him, my voice gentle, but inside I was in turmoil. "It's in the past." But I knew, deep down, it wasn't that simple. Something had changed between Chris and me, a boundary had been broken, a stain had been imprinted deep in my soul. "I can't stop thinking about you," Chris continued, his eyes looking directly at me, a look full of longing and despair. "I know this is wrong, but I can't control my feelings." I was silent. I could feel the sincerity in Chris's words, the torment in his soul. I also felt something similar in my own heart, a feeling I had tried to bury all this time, a forbidden and dangerous feeling. In the flickering firelight, Chris moved closer to me. He reached out and touched my cheek, a gentle but suggestive gesture that made me tremble. I didn't pull away. I was as if hypnotized by his eyes, by this closeness. I love you," Chris said, his voice whispering, like a confession. That confession echoed in the silent room, like a thunderclap. I knew I should refuse, should stop Chris. But in that moment, all my reason seemed to vanish. I only felt the loneliness, the longing for David, and the yearning to be loved, to be protected, a feeling I had lost a long time ago. The storm was not only raging outside the house, but also raging fiercely in my own heart. I knew I was standing on the edge of sin, but I no longer had the strength to step back. Chris's confession, along with the passionate kiss, completely shattered my last line of defense. Like a dam bursting, all reason, all restraint collapsed. In that instant, the world around me completely disappeared, leaving only intense emotions surging, swirling within me like a whirlwind. I returned Chris's kiss, a kiss both sweet and sinful, both longing and fearful. It was no longer a gentle touch on the forehead, but a possession, a complete surrender, a rebellion against everything I had once believed to be right. Chris's arms tightened around me, pulling me into a vortex of passion and guilt. I was immersed in his embrace, forgetting all barriers, all moral rules, all binding relationships. In the quiet log cabin amidst the stormy night, only two people remained, seeking comfort and solace in each other's loneliness. The sound of the rain seemed to blend with my pounding heartbeat, the howling wind like the sigh of my conscience. But I no longer had the strength to resist. That night, a boundary was broken. Eleanor and Chris crossed the line of their stepmother-stepson relationship, entering a forbidden and complex relationship. A relationship that I knew would bring suffering and torment, but I couldn't stop it. The next morning, as the first rays of dawn crept through the window cracks, I woke up with a heavy feeling, as if a rock was weighing down my chest. I looked beside me. Chris was still fast asleep. His face looked so peaceful, showing no sign of torment or guilt. Looking at him like that, I felt even more guilty. I gently sat up, trying not to wake Chris. I looked around the room, the memories of last night flooding back into my mind, each kiss, each touch, each whisper. All were clear and vivid, as if they had just happened. A feeling of regret and fear surged within me, like a tsunami. I knew I had done something wrong, something I never thought I would do, something I didn't know how to face. I left the bed and went downstairs. The house was still as quiet as a tomb, only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock echoing in the space. I made a cup of coffee, but I couldn't swallow it. My throat was tight, my insides in turmoil. The bitterness of the coffee reflected the bitterness in my heart. After a while, Chris also woke up. He came downstairs and saw me sitting at the dining table. He walked over to me, his eyes full of tenderness and worry, making my heart clench. "Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle, full of concern. "Are you all right?" I looked at Chris. I didn't know how to answer him. I couldn't lie, but I also didn't want to tell the truth, the cruel and shameful truth. I don't know," I said, my voice trembling, weak. Chris sat down next to me, taking my hand. His hand was warm and strong, bringing me a strange feeling of comfort, a feeling I had longed for so long. "I'm sorry," Chris said, his voice sincere and full of regret. "I know I did wrong. I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupted Chris, a heavy sigh escaping my chest. "It was both of our faults." I didn't want to put all the blame on him. I knew I also had a part in this. We were both silent for a moment. No one said anything, but we both understood that there had been an irreversible change between us. A crack had appeared, not knowing when it could be mended. Throughout that day, Chris and I tried to avoid each other. We ate separately, did our own things, and minimized communication as much as possible. The house became heavy and suffocating, like a prison holding sinful secrets. In the evening, I knew I couldn't hide forever. I needed to talk to Chris, to face the truth. "We need to talk," I said as Chris just walked into the living room. My voice was firm, but inside I was full of worry. Chris nodded, sitting down opposite me. He looked at me with worried and expectant eyes. "What happened was wrong," I said, my voice trembling but trying to maintain a resolute look. "We can't continue like this." Chris was silent for a moment and then said, his voice full of despair, "I know. But I can't stop loving you." Chris's words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew that I also had feelings for Chris, a forbidden and dangerous feeling, but I couldn't accept this relationship. "We can't," I said, my voice choked. "You're my husband's son. This is wrong, it's forbidden." Chris looked at me with painful, pleading eyes. "Then what should I do?" he asked, his voice full of helplessness. "I can't live without you." I was silent. I didn't know how to answer Chris. I also didn't know what to do with my feelings, with my guilt, with the dim future ahead. In the quiet night, amidst the lapping waves by the lake, two people were sinking into a forbidden relationship, a boundary that had been broken, leaving torment, regret, and unanswered questions. The storm in my heart had not yet subsided. The sound of the slamming door echoed through the quiet house, tearing apart the suffocating and oppressive atmosphere that Chris and I had created all day. I startled and spun around, my heart pounding as if it wanted to jump out of my chest. Standing in the doorway, Robert's figure appeared, his face contorted in extreme anger. His eyes, usually warm and gentle, now blazed, shifting from me to Chris, filled with suspicion, pain, and resentment. I had never seen him like this. The room fell into a deathly silence. Only the rain still drizzled outside the window, as if witnessing a family tragedy that I myself had caused. The blood in my body seemed to freeze. I felt cold from head to toe. I wanted to explain, to say something to soothe Robert's anger, to salvage the situation, but my throat was choked, unable to utter a word. I could only stand there, silent and trembling, like a caught criminal. Chris stood frozen, his face pale, drained of all color. He looked at his father with a mixture of fear and regret. I could clearly see the deep remorse in his eyes, the belated repentance. He knew that he had made an unforgivable mistake, not only with his father, but also with me. What is going on here?" Robert growled, each word grinding from between his teeth. His gaze remained fixed on me, as if wanting to see through my soul. His voice trembled, unable to believe what he had just witnessed, unable to believe the woman he had once loved and trusted. I tried to regain my composure, but my voice still trembled, out of tune. "Robert, it's not what you think." A weak and hopeless excuse. "Not what I think?" Robert scoffed, a bitter and ironic smile, a smile that hurt even more than accusations. "I just saw my wife kissing my son, and you tell me it's not what I think?" I hung my head, tears starting to flow, hot and bitter. I knew that no explanation could justify my actions. I had betrayed him, betrayed his love, betrayed myself. Chris took a step forward, trying to talk to his father, as if wanting to bear all the blame. "Dad, I can explain." "Shut up!" Robert roared, cutting Chris off harshly. "I don't want to hear anything from you." He looked at Chris with contempt and disappointment, as if he no longer recognized his own son. He turned to look at me, his eyes cold and distant, as if looking at a complete stranger. "And you? I never expected you to do this," he said, his voice choking with pain. "I trusted you, I loved you, and yet—" Robert shook his head, not finishing his sentence. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Chris and me in a heavy silence of guilt and shame, a silence more terrifying than any accusation. I sank to the floor, tears flowing uncontrollably. I felt like I had lost everything: Robert's love, Chris's respect, and the peace in my own soul. I had destroyed everything I cherished with my own hands. Chris looked at me with eyes full of pain and helplessness. He moved closer to me, wanting to touch me, wanting to comfort me, but then pulled his hand back, as if he was afraid of himself, afraid of what he had caused. He knew that he no longer had the right to comfort me. "I'm sorry," Chris said, his voice choked with remorse. "It's all my fault." I didn't answer. I could only cry for the loss, cry for the mistakes, cry for the dim future ahead. From the window, I saw Robert walk out of the house, heading straight towards the lake. The rain still fell relentlessly, as if washing away the stains on his soul, or at least he hoped so. He stood by the lake, looking out at the dark and still water. I could imagine the heart-wrenching pain he was enduring, a betrayal he could never forgive. I knew that our lives would never be the same. I had lost the man I loved, and he had also lost the son he once trusted. In the stormy night by Lake Michigan, 3 people were sinking into their own pain, deep emotional wounds that they didn't know when could heal. Chapter 7, Aftermath, Eleanor's Perspective. After that horrific night, the log cabin was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Robert, he barely spoke to me. He avoided me, as if I were something dirty, disgusting. When he was forced to communicate, it was only a few short, cold, dagger-like sentences. The look in his eyes contained utter disappointment and a chilling distance, as if I were a complete stranger, someone he had never known. That feeling was more painful than any scolding. Chris had left the next morning, as Robert had ordered. He didn't say a word to me before leaving. I only heard the sound of the slamming door echoing in the early morning stillness, then the sound of a car driving away, gradually fading into the distance. After that, a terrifying silence enveloped the house, a silence heavy with guilt and loss. I felt completely devastated, as if a black hole was swallowing me from within. I had lost the husband I loved with all my heart, and now, I had also hurt his son, someone I had promised to take care of. I blamed myself, tormented myself for my weakness and unforgivable mistake. The following days passed in loneliness and torment. I didn't know how to face the future, a future that I had destroyed with my own hands. One afternoon, I decided to go for a walk by the lake. I needed some fresh air, some quiet to soothe my broken soul. Lake Michigan was still as calm and vast as ever, but in my eyes, it carried a mournful and lonely look, accurately reflecting my mood. I sat down on a large rock by the lake, looking out at the vast water. The autumn wind still blew strongly, carrying the cold of winter, seeping into my skin, but the cold in my heart was many times colder. I recalled happy memories with David, the peaceful days at this log cabin, the laughter, the warm embraces. I also remembered the brief moments with Chris, the tremors that I had tried to hide, but now had risen strongly, haunting me. All that was now only the past, fragments of a broken family, never to be mended. Suddenly, I saw a figure approaching me. It was Mark. My heart clenched slightly. He walked closer to me, his face still carrying a hint of sadness, but his eyes were gentler, no longer with the disappointment and distance as the last time we met. Eleanor, Mark gently called my name, his voice soft and full of concern. I looked up at Mark, tears welling up, unable to hold back anymore. I didn't know what to say, only knew how to cry for the losses, cry for the mistakes, cry for myself. Mark sat down beside me, gently placing his hand on my shoulder. I know everything, he said, his voice deep and sympathetic. David told me about Chris. He was always worried about his son. I was silent, hanging my head. I didn't know how to react, didn't know if I deserved his sympathy. I'm not here to judge you, Mark continued, his voice sincere. I just want to know if you're okay. I looked at Mark, tears still streaming down my cheeks. I did something very wrong, I said, my voice choked with regret. I know, Mark said. But everyone makes mistakes sometimes. The important thing is that we learn to face them and move on. I looked at Mark with grateful eyes. His words were like a faint ray of light in my darkness, bringing a little comfort and hope. Chris has left, Mark said. He needs time to think and rearrange his life. I nodded, trying to swallow my tears. I understood that Chris needed his own space, needed time to face what had happened. What about you? Mark asked, his eyes looking at me with worry. What are you going to do? I was silent for a moment and then said, my voice weak, I don't know. I need time, and I also don't know if I can forgive myself. Mark nodded. He understood my confusion and difficulty, the torment and guilt that were torturing me. I'll always be here for you, Mark said, his voice sincere and warm. If you need anything, please tell me. I looked at Mark, a glimmer of hope flickering in my heart, a faint but enough hope for me to cling to. I knew that the road ahead was still very long and difficult, but I was no longer alone. I still had Mark, a sincere and kind friend, who would always be by my side, even though I had made a terrible mistake. Outside, the wind still blew, but the sky had begun to clear. The sunlight began to shine on the lake, dispelling the dark clouds. I looked out at the lake, a feeling of peace gradually returned to my heart, a fragile but extremely precious peace. I knew that life still went on, despite the losses and mistakes. I would learn to face the past and look towards a future, although not clear, but still with glimmers of hope. Just then, my phone vibrated. A message from Chris appeared on the screen. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't know what the message contained, but I knew it would change everything. So, what do you think the message will be? What will Chris say to me after everything that has happened? And will I be able to forgive myself and find happiness again? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions.